Welcome to Every Believer Confident podcast. Today we're asking the question, can we blame Christians for the problems in society? This is not a new thing. Augustine in the 5th century, in writing his large book, The City of God, which was written to help Christians in difficult times as Rome was falling, his city was invaded, and Christians were beginning to experience a new kind of persecution and difficulty. Augustine writes this book to help Christians know how to live in the midst of difficult times. In the first few pages, he mentions the fact that when the barbarians were coming into his city, many Christians fled to the churches, and many unbelievers joined them, and the Christians allowed them to, and the barbarians spared them and didn't try to discern between Christian and non-Christian. And as a result, then, the unbelievers were spared. But as soon as the danger was over, Augustine noticed that some of these non-believers would go out and blame Christians for the fall of the city and for the fall of the Roman Empire. In other words, the very ones who were protected by Christianity were still complaining and blaming Christians for the problems in society. That continues today in many arenas. People view religion itself, or Christianity in particular, as the problem. And if we would simply rid ourselves of religious belief, then we would solve the problems in society. One area that this is common in is evolutionary psychology. So evolutionary psychology is an attempt to explain human behavior apart from any reference to God, the image of God, our design for a particular purpose or in a certain way, and putting everything in the category of natural selection, evolutionary process. This has spawned many, many books and articles as people try to figure out, why do humans do the things that they do? As Christians, we know that everything that we do is either a reflection of the image of God in us and the command to go into the world and cultivate it, to take the things, the potentiality that God has given us in this world and make new things out of it, or alternately, evidence of the fall into sin. But evolutionary psychology rejects all that and says, no, only natural selection, survival of the fittest can explain. And as a result, then, evolutionary psychology is full of speculation. They look at everything humans do and they try to figure out, how did this develop over thousands or millions of years as apes developed into hominoids and humanoids? And how did we develop this evolutionary practice without any particular purpose other than survival? And quite frankly, much of evolutionary psychology is ludicrous. It's ridiculous. Even Stephen Jay Gould, the late Harvard scientist, thought so. One book I'm reading recently is a book called The Status Game by an evolutionary psychologist, Will Storr. And it's a very interesting book. Some of what he says is true. His basic argument is that a desire for status is at the root, underlies all that we do. And there's some truth to that. Our desire for status is what motivates us to do many things. Our desire, for example, to get a well-paying job or a respectable job, to have a nice house or a nice car, to have children who are obedient, to dress in a certain way. All that reflects the status game, and there's a certain amount of truth in it. But Will Storr reduces then everything that we do to status, and it's too simplified. It's an oversimplification. For example, he says on page 43, the current dominant theory of why humans developed language is to gossip. I'm sorry, there's just no way I'm going to believe that. He doesn't present any evidence for that. It's all speculation. But according to him, we have to explain everything that people do by a means of survival, and he does that. His argument then that we argue or we live for status is only partially convincing. But one of the things that he does is he likes to point the finger at religion and say, this is what's holding us back. The fact that people still believe things that aren't scientifically proven, he believes is keeping us from further development. He says this on page 130. In the last 500 years, we've been through a scientific revolution and an enlightenment, quote unquote, great intellectual movements that led to the wonders of modernity, the modern world, and showed the irrational beliefs of old to be false. There's no reason anymore to cling to mad ideas. So why do billions still cling? Why do billions of people still have religion? Why do we remain superstitious, gullible, and religious? The persistence of irrationality is a puzzle, but the status game suggests an explanation. We mimic not just the behavior of those who tell us how to live, but their beliefs. The better we believe, the higher we rise, and so faith, not truth, is incentivized. He basically assumes that religion is not the result of truth, of any reality, but it's simply, like everything else in life, a status game. And his argument then is that religion holds us back from being advanced people. And the truth is, it's a laughable idea. Historians will tell you, people like Tom Holland in his book Dominion, will tell you that until Christianity came along, there was no such thing as the concept of inherent human dignity and value in every person, or even the idea of the individual. Those were ideas Christianity brought along with the ideas that we were made in the image of God and we are creations of God. Other religions and worldviews at that time in the ancient world just simply didn't believe those things. So when someone tries to tell you religion's the problem in the world, if we would just get rid of religion, one of the things you can do is remind them of the 20th century. In the 20th century, between communism and fascism, both secular ideologies divorced from religion that were humanistic, those two ideologies resulted in the deaths of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people. In other words, the most recent murderous century in our history as human beings is not anything to do with religion, but entirely to do with the absence of it. Along with that is another concept that's taught in this book by William Cavanaugh, the myth of religious violence. In this book, he basically seeks to explode the idea that there's something about religion that especially leads to violence. And Cavanaugh says the facts simply don't back that up. He says, rather, this was a myth invented in the 20th century by secular humanists to try to pin the blame on something, and so they pinned it on religion, as if secularism, as if atheism and humanism are not religions in themselves, which they are most certainly. So this whole idea of the myth of religious violence, that Christianity or religion in general is at the root of the problems in the world. And if we would just get rid of that and convince people to stop being religious and to be scientific modern people, we would do away with the ills of the world. My friend, that was the exact mindset over 120 years ago at the turn of the 20th century. You can read the literature in the late 1800s where, with the rise of Darwinism and Marxism and atheism, people were predicting the end of poverty, the end of disease in the world. They were basically saying, as we do away with religion and just turn to science, we will bring heaven to earth. And instead, what happened over the next 50 years was the slaughter of more people than any other time period in the history of humanity. So as Christians, when we're accused of these things, when people raise these issues, we should argue, combat those ideas with good arguments. It is simply not the case that religion is somehow more geared toward violence than other ideologies or belief systems. It is simply not true that religion is holding us back. As I mentioned, Tom Holland, a secular historian, and his book Dominion, he points out the fact that Christianity has brought much good to the world. In fact, much of what we think of as human rights springs not from a secular worldview, but from Christianity, which says that God made us. We did not arise out of the primordial slime, and we are made in God's image, and therefore we have inherent dignity and value. Just because Christians have not always lived up to that does not mean it's not true. The other alternative is that we are accidents of nature, and it's really hard to imagine how we can come up with dignity and sanctity of life when we are simply accidents of nature. So I hope this has helped you. If you deal with or come across someone who argues that Christianity is bad for the world, That usually comes from secular humanists, atheists. You will not find it among historians, and it certainly is not the truth. If this has been a help to you and you'd like to support the ministry of Apologetics for the Church, you can go to apologeticsforthechurch.org and click on the support button. Thank you.